Okay? I think so. I've got a loud voice. Howdy. Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you. I am not a researcher. I am not an expert. But I have a software company that is tied into environmental health and safety and now expanding into environmental social governance with sustainability software. I've worked with Debelina in the past to explore the idea of sustainability in a very pragmatic way. And I'm excited to be here. In serving as the mayor here in Texas A&M, we have two cities. We often say two cities, one community, College Station and the city of Bryan. 150 years ago, the city of Bryan starts one of the oldest cities in the state of Texas. And in fact, some business leaders in Bryan donated the land that you're on right now to create the university that we're here. So it's a tight-knit community. We often say two cities, one community, but there's really three because Texas A&M is one as well. So as the mayor, I've worked with several different disasters, whether it's planning or whether it's just dealing with them. Tornadoes, minor flooding, but COVID was, it may not appear to be tied into this, but I see it absolutely tied, and maybe for all of you it is tied into it. The winter storm Uri, which hit the entire state of Texas, is another thing that we did. The city of Bryan actually is the one, owns the only power company here, produces power in this area of Texas. So we were directly managing that as power providers and as people in the city. So that's critical, and obviously if you seen on the news today, we have 104-degree temperature as the high today. It'll feel like about 115. So I think, Debelina, you'll feel right at home here today. But that deal, we have drought. Some of those are acute, short-term, immediate-term, things like tornadoes. Some of them, like COVID, are very long-term but come out of the blue. Some of them, are like drought, are disasters that we know are coming in periods of low rain and are sometimes predictable long term, but we don't have to deal with them for a long time. We'll hopefully get some rain here in a month, and that problem will subside a little bit. But all of them tie into sustainability and how local community leaders work with people is something I'm very excited to learn from you, and I excited to see the work of you experts helping people who are non-experts like me to manage those types of crises and to make our community sustainable. So thank you for having me.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. I'd like to give a brief overview of the organization and then some of our initiatives. The U.S. Business Council for Sustainable Development was founded in 1992, which means this is our 30th year. And the founder, Andy Mannion, is still very much involved with the Business Council, and stay tuned for more notifications about some special things that we will do in celebration of our 30th year. The Business Council was founded from the premise of pulling together a very broad cross-section of industry, business, and the like to focus on various sustainability-related topics. Since we were formed in 1992, sustainability was just getting started, so part of the challenge was just understanding what sustainability is and what does it look like for various sectors. Over the years, we've had the opportunity to identify many very successful platforms or programs that are focused on either water, circular economy, and several others, and our most recent one is our Carbon Collaborative. It's a regionally focused initiative, and we have two, one for the Gulf of Mexico, the other in the Great Lakes region. And this initiative pulls together companies and nonprofits as well as academia and solution providers to identify ways to help reduce carbon emissions specifically, since we, I believe in this room probably agree that greenhouse gas emissions are significant contributors to climate change. And we've identified several decarbonization strategies to work on, such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, hydrogen, as well as electrification, solar, wind, nature-based solutions, and some geothermal as well. Those decarbonization strategies equate to working groups that meet on a monthly cadence, and we have representatives from all of the areas that I mentioned earlier, and the objective is to come together and identify specific partnership and project opportunities. And we invite those who are interested in being a part of the conversation, not just the conversation, but being a part of the solution, to participate with us. We are still meeting virtually for the most part. We had our first in-person meeting last month, as a matter of fact, and many of us had not seen each other in person before, and it was really a tremendous experience. When we talk about not only decarbonization, but sustainability in a broader perspective, one of the things that we are being very intentional about is this. Equity is essential. Equity is really built in all of the sustainability related goals. It's been there all along. However, since I've come in seat as of October of last year as the executive director, we're raising the level of equity to the point where we're being much more intentional to include it. And here's what I mean by that. We're including minority serving institutions as part of our platforms. We are reaching out, and we're starting with minority serving institutions in terms of academic institutions, specifically historically black colleges and universities, as well as Hispanic institutions and indigenous communities. We know the statistics in terms of minority communities being negatively impacted by climate change. We want to make sure that we're very much intentional about including them as part of the solutions. So we, as part of our initiatives going forward, very pleased to announce that we've been working very closely, certainly with Texas A&M, as well as Fairview A&M here in the state of Texas, and working closely with HBCUs and other parts of the country as well. In terms of connectivity to disasters and the like, there's several that I've personally been involved in, either impacted by, and then from a business council perspective, and I'll go into details about it later, I think we've been very instrumental in helping address some of the challenges related to disasters, whether natural or man-made. But I'll pause there. I'm glad to be here today. Looking forward to the output from today's session, your thoughts and engagement. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you.
I thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to be with all you fine people. Just like the mayor said, I'm not in academia. I'm not a researcher. I'm here to represent the nonprofit sector, and I want to thank you. I did meet Debolina through TDM, several conversations, and she did twist my arm, and I wound up saying yes. She's very, she's good at that, but I'm enjoying her friendship, and I'm happy to be here. I do bring to the table a little different. I'm that fifth wheel, right? I represent the nonprofit. I do work for a faith-based nonprofit that has a disaster mission. I don't know if what you guys know about the Salvation Army, but we are one of the largest social services agencies nationwide. And in disasters, we bring that to the survivors and the people that we serve. I come with a little over 12 years experience in disaster services and relief operations, working in the field. I'm also part of the Texas Salvation Army Incident Management Team. We're a little bit at the tip of the spear. We go in and we set up our operations in those affected areas and help those individuals with relief supplies, food, water, and whatever they may need at that time. Part of my job in Blue Skies is volunteer recruitment, training, and retention. Without volunteers and without people coming alongside us to help us do the work that we do, we wouldn't be able to respond the way we do. Debolina did mention that I am the current chair the Texas Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, for short, Texas VOAD. It's easier to say, not quite a tongue twister. I've served in that role for about 4.5 years. And so I'll be passing the torch to somebody come January. But I've learned a lot. I've gained a lot of partnerships, relationships. In the nonprofit world, relationships is what it's about. Knowing who to go to, who you can partner with to help those affected by disaster. And I do thank you for allowing me to be here today and learn from everyone here.
I want to first thank Professor Devalina and her team for the excellent job they've done in planning for this and getting us all here. And I'm also very humbled by being in the same room with so many experts and so many eminent achievers. Just wanted to take you through a couple of things by way of introduction. I am actually, as Devalina was saying, my wife and I were with the World Bank for about 25 years, but before that I was a civil servant, like some of you, in India for about 15 years. And in the course of those 15 years, there wasn't a single year that we didn't have to deal with disasters in some shape or form. Some of those were annual, floods, cyclones, some were man-made. But in the discussions that we were having in this room before we convened, I heard talk about a drought, and in fact Mac was there, is at the forefront of dealing with this creeping disaster. So way back in 1986, when I was 25 years old and a freshly minted civil servant, the area that I was responsible for, it had about 2 million people in the western state of Gujarat in India. We had had a drought for about 2 years, no rain. It was a semi-arid area. The reservoirs ran dry, the rivers and streams ran dry. It was a mainly agricultural society, so my job as the civil servant there, I was all of 25, was to make sure that people who needed to get employment were able to get employment in public works. We had to bring in wagons, railway wagons, carrying drinking water for people and for cattle for a year. For that, we had to coordinate with the railways, and we had to open relief works where thousands of people were given employment. And to be able to do that, we had to work with our engineers and our non-government organizations and our political parties and our elected representatives to quickly prepare public works that were shovel-ready, so to speak. And so we opened public works. I think about maybe 250,000 people were employed at the peak. And overseeing that, we didn't have technology, we didn't have financial resources of the kind that the US has, so we were improvising, so to speak, on the fly. But the great thing was that nobody died. We were able to contain it, and much like what happened with the coronavirus pandemic, we had to learn to build the bicycle as we were riding it. And that was my very, very first lesson in disaster management and resilience, which was that if you reach out to the community, you will get answers. And wisdom always comes from the community, whether it's the local community or the wider community, or a more amorphous community of experts like all of you are. So that's something we learned and we applied. But the other disasters that I remember sitting in this room today, I think the most telling one was 2004, the tsunami that struck Indonesia and other countries. At that time, my team and I were working in what was then post-Suharto turbulent Indonesia that was trying to chart a new course for itself. And when the tsunami struck, it was the day before Christmas, I remember. Everybody was on leave in the country and in Washington in the institution where I worked. I still remember going to the city of Aceh, which is up on the northwestern tip of the Indonesian archipelago and the worst hit in the tsunami. And we went there, I think, maybe 15 days after the tsunami hit. And it was heartrending to see the power and the force of that tsunami, the wall of water that came across. There were ships that were carried 5 or 6 miles inland, stranded, sitting on top of houses. Thousands of people died, as you remember. But again, what that international disaster taught people like us, who are working on development, was that when you have disasters that cross boundaries, one part of the challenge is obviously coordination, and it goes back to some of the challenge topics that are there on the wall. But I think what really struck us at that time was the kind of money and resources that poured in after the disaster. And this goes back to the issue of resilience, I guess. It was really very difficult for the government of Indonesia to keep track of all the resources that were coming in, from their own citizens, from the international community, from the private sector, from NGOs. So part of my job then with my team was actually to put up a website, and this is a screenshot from, I think, 2004. We set up this website to track the funding and to track how it was used so that money could be used most effectively in support of the post-disaster reconstruction and resilience efforts. But I think it's a challenge we still have today. We have big disasters, big impacts, but then money pours in, resources pour in. How do we ensure that they're used most effectively and most efficiently? And more importantly, how are they deployed to help those in most need of those resources? So I think the last thought I would leave you with, we were talking about resilience and partnerships between academia and businesses and citizens, and reflecting on some of the things I have learned in the last 40 years of being in the public service, is pretty much everywhere. It doesn't matter what the country is. I don't think it matters what the setting is. But if you think of academia, businesses, and citizens as 3 parts of a community that really has to deal with disasters and resilience and disaster management, I think you have a challenge with political accountability sometimes in some settings. I think there is a challenge sometimes at the bottom with community-driven local participation. But I think what I'm hearing here and what I've heard in so many countries around the world is that disasters, because they're becoming more frequent, communities are realizing that they have to cope with that. And so community-driven local participation mechanisms are there pretty much across the world. It's a question of how effective they are. But in the middle between the accountability system and the local participation, you have different institutions that have a role to play in determining whether the outcomes are positive or less so. So in other words, if you have the oversight institutions, the effective local government, civil society, media, and the business environment, if the interactions are positive and if the collaboration is there, you would probably get good outcomes. But in a more negative scenario, one of the outcomes is corruption. And I think one of the questions that occurred to us, and I was privileged to have worked in about 70 countries, is what explains the sustainability, if you like, of corruption? What explains the resilience of corruption? We are talking about resilience from a very different perspective. But if you invert the picture, so to speak, the question then becomes, what has enabled phenomena like corruption to thrive? What role does it play? And what does it mean for disaster resilience with all the volumes of resources that flow in? And resources get hijacked, sometimes to not so appropriate uses and to private ends. So I think when we think about resilience, and disaster response, particularly in governance challenge environments. I think the biggest challenge probably is trying to figure out how to generate positive outcomes and lessen the possibility of less positive outcomes. So I'll leave you with this thought. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Professor.
So my very first Texas disaster experience occurred in 1984. The winter of 1984, I was living here in College Station, and I had signed up to take the GRE exam in Austin, Texas. And there was an inch of snowfall that occurred across most of South and East and Central Texas, and the state shut down. And I laughed, being from the Northeast of the United States, because I knew how to drive in snow, and 1 inch of snow wouldn't have shut down anything. But here I was, and the only thing that was open during that snowstorm of 1984 was the GRE testing center in Austin. They did not cancel that exam. So I drove to Austin, and I was about the only car on the highway. So it was a wonderful experience for me. I didn't have to worry about other people sliding or slipping, and I got to Austin just fine, took my GRE exam, and was admitted into Texas A&M University in 1985. So that was my first Texas disaster experience. And then we'll fast forward a few decades to 2021's Winter Uri. And it was a much more severe experience, as we all know. And I spent 4 months living in my living room with my husband and my 2 dogs, because our whole house had flooded from broken pipes and hot water heaters. And so it was really kind of a wonderful bookend experience, from that 1 inch of snowfall to winter freeze that hung around for way too long, and really gave me that first-hand experience of what people go through when they lose a lot of things around them, and really gave me empathy for the people that I've worked with over the last 10 years during disasters, because now I've really experienced it on my own. We had no water, we had no electricity, food was in short supply in many places, and so we had to make do with what we had. And so there were a lot of disasters in between that 1984 winter storm and the 2021 winter storm. And so I've experienced these as a researcher in the Department of Oceanography, and one of the great things about being a researcher is storms and other types of disasters give you opportunity for research. And so wearing my researcher hat, I've benefited from a lot of disasters, and have had questions and funding to answer those questions to help the natural resources in Texas. In 2011, I became the director of Texas Sea Grant, and our organization is one of 34 Sea Grant programs funded by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And we are all located in coastal and Great Lakes states around the country. And we all have very similar missions, and we all have very similar programs, but we all cater to the needs of our independent or different states. And so what we do here in Texas is very different than what Maine Sea Grant does in Texas, or what Maine Sea Grant does in Maine, because of the inherent variation in what those state needs are. So in Texas, we've been here for 51 years this September, and we have 3 main components to our Sea Grant program, like the other Sea Grant programs. We support research, we support education, and we support extension, engagement, and outreach. And so at Texas Sea Grant, we have a team of extension professionals, and Develina is our newest extension professional, who, for the most part, live and work in coastal communities from Beaumont to Brownsville, and they have significant trust relationships with the communities there. They work with the communities to try to understand what the needs in those communities are. And the idea is that having those folks in those communities, knowing what the needs are, that information will feed up and be incorporated into our requests for proposals that we release every 2 years across the state of Texas. We look for faculty researchers primarily to address the greatest challenges and societal problems that our coastal communities identify. And so we do that work, that research, extension, and education work in 4 primary areas. We're focused on healthy coastal ecosystems, we're focused on resilient communities and economies, we're focused on sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, and we're also focused on STEM literacy and workforce development. And those are very broad areas, and they involve multidisciplines. And so we are always seeking input from social scientists, from law, policy, and planning, from engineers, from mathematicians, from scientists, and to address the challenges that we have in Texas now and in the future. It's going to take all those disciplines working together sometimes to come up with the solutions that are needed to some of our most pressing issues related to disaster resilience. So as an organization, only part of our team has worked on disaster resilience, and only part of our research funding has gone towards disaster resilience. But I want to call your attention to a couple of things in your packet. We have been involved in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill disaster, and for 10 years had a wonderful program that was funded by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative to bring the scientific findings and discoveries that was funded by GOMRI to the public. And so you see one of our publications here. And that very well describes the work that we do. We want to fund research. We want to discover things that we then can communicate back to our coastal communities so that we can help them and the challenges that they have. And so there's a two-way flow of information, and communication is at the heart of that. And so we are always looking for ways to communicate the science and share the best available science with our coastal communities, whether it's research that we fund or not. And so our oil spill science program just sunset last year, and it was a great program to help us communicate the science that was being funded by the GOMRI program. We also have a lot of materials, some of which are in your packet, to help Texans prepare for and respond to natural disasters such as hurricanes and tornadoes, and we're going to have to add winter freezes into that portfolio now too. And so before, during, and after disasters, we typically distribute materials in paper format to people because, as we learned after Hurricane Harvey, cell phone towers are down afterwards, and people don't always have use of their cell phones. And so these paper products, which seem antiquated at this point in time, actually become very useful during and after a storm because people sometimes don't have the ability to power up their phones or power up their computers. And so we still keep these in paper format, have them on web-based formats as well. So we do a lot of work during disasters, in advance of disasters, after disasters, and it can be anything from distributing materials to helping relocate boats that have been stranded on the land and need to be connected back to their original owners, to helping the state try to determine the economic impact of some of the fisheries losses that have been suffered in some of these storms, as well as responding to other needs in communities that are specific to each of the different communities. So working on food distribution lines and helping people recover any way that's needed are the kinds of things we have done. We are a small team, however, and we don't have the resources to meet all the needs that are present in our Texas coastal communities. But by partnering with organizations like the Salvation Army and the American Red Cross and many of the state and federal agencies, we do have the ability and the nimbleness to get into places quicker than many other organizations can and try to direct resources to those areas. So that in a nutshell is Texas Sea Grant, and we're always evolving to meet the needs of Texans and Texas, and so as our disaster needs grow, so will our response to those disasters. And so going back to my original story, if you've lived 6 decades as I have, you've seen that need grow. And if you're in your 20s or 30s now, I can bet you $100,000 that by the time you're 60, you're going to be sitting thinking back and reflecting on your early career and your early life, and you're going to see similar things that I and others have seen, and that is that the disasters are more frequent, they're more intense, and because there are more people, there are more of us who are affected by these events. And so there's a greater need, and I don't think we've scaled up enough to meet the needs that we currently have. And when you think about the future and the need to scale up for the future, that really is an onerous task. And so I'm really excited to be part of this particular workshop because I think that Develina and her colleagues and the researchers here are thinking about the future and what we can do, not just now, but what we can do 20 years from now and 30 years from now to meet the need of a growing population that needs food, that needs housing, that needs water, and that needs energy. So thank you all for coming today, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this.
First question is, just talk a little bit about your personal or organizational experiences with disasters. Again, we've covered a lot of that, but and they can be man-made, they can be natural disasters, they can be something that's very short-term or long-term. So just anything else any of you would like to add on just a personal anecdote around experience? Yes.
So I want to talk a little bit about Hurricane Harvey. And Hurricane Harvey was an incredible experience, whether you were living in Port Aransas, Houston, or Beaumont, and or in College Station. And for those of you who weren't in College Station at the time, College Station became the epicenter for the response that was occurring in Houston. And that was really exciting for me to see that we had such an incredible role to play in that response effort. And I think that it's really a great opportunity for the future, because we know that if you get 27 inches of rain in College Station, we're going to be okay. And we're going to make do. And you can set up all the teams that you need to help others downstream who have more significant problems. And so I hope that this area grows as a staging area for a Houston response in the future, because I think that this is a great location for that. But most of my experience was actually down further south in the smaller coastal communities. And I got out about 4 days after the storm passed, because I wanted to experience what those communities were experiencing, and I used to live down there. And so I wanted to see what it looked like. I wanted to talk to the people. I wanted to find out where Texas Sea Grant could fit in. And at the time, almost every Texas Sea Grant staff person living along the coast had suffered their own personal damages. So they couldn't get out. So I was it, because I was here in College Station. So I got in a car, put a bunch of materials in the car, and drove. And my first stop was Port Aransas, Texas, which had been severely impacted, along with Rockport and Aransas Pass. And the one shining light that I found when I got there were people who lived there were doing it on their own and helping each other. They had set up a place where they were barbecuing the food that had been left over in their freezers and refrigerators that would have spoiled if they didn't cook it. there were people that were set up donation centers and were bringing things in from other places. And they were doing that before anybody showed up. And then the nonprofits started showing up and helping, and then the state agencies started showing up and helping, and then the feds started showing up and helping as well. And so it was really an experience for me to talk to people and to see people who had virtually nothing and were living on their lawns, sometimes just sleeping on the grass, sometimes in a tent, and trying to figure out what we could do and how we could help was really a monumental challenge for me. And people said, well, you know, serve some food, or can you go and find some water? And so I found myself varying materials back and forth from places that didn't have storm damage, like Corpus Christi, back to Port Aransas and places like that. And so that made me feel, you know, momentarily useful, but it was just a small thing that I was able to do in a greater effort that was needed. But one of the things that I learned, and this really kind of came as a shock to me, was that there was a FEMA disaster recovery center set up in Aransas Pass, and it was probably the smallest room one could have found. And there were 2 people serving thousands of people that were on a line waiting for assistance. And as I traveled to different disaster recovery centers along the coast, what I found was that the places that had the most victims had the least support. And so by the time I got to Victoria, Texas, that was the biggest FEMA disaster recovery center with the most people, and they only had 1 victim there when I walked in. And so I went to speak to the manager, and I tried to encourage him to move his operation down to the coast where the people were impacted. And he said, I can't do that. And I said, why not? And he said, because Washington, D.C. tells us where we have to go and what we have to do. And so I realized that that was both, you know, an impediment to the response, but it was also an opportunity and an opportunity to connect with FEMA on a different level and talk to them about their operations, which they understood really well and accepted my advice. And they did actually move some people down to Aransas Pass and down to Port Aransas and down to Rockport following my visit. And so I felt like I have helped out in just a very small way by doing that, but it took a while. It took several weeks, and the people down in the areas that were greatly affected needed much more. And so when I was down there, we did distribute our materials, and a lot of people were very thankful for the materials that we gave them. And these materials include everything from how to clean up your home after it's been flooded to how to keep yourself and your family and your pets safe afterwards. And so it was really an interesting experience for me. But I was overwhelmed, just like many of the other people who were down there trying to help with the response and the recovery. And so I think there are so many research needs that are hopefully going to be addressed in part 2 of the proposal and the grant that you're going to be awarded, because I think that if you talk to the people who experienced that storm, from Port Aransas all the way up to Beaumont, you're going to find very different needs, very different responses, and very different stories about that storm and how we need to do better for the next one.
Yes, Claude, please.
Thanks, Pam, for sharing that. I'll touch on my experience with Harvey. By the way, I'm up from Houston, so I went through some of that. But I want to spend a couple of minutes on a different disaster, the Deepwater Horizon. And the 2 perspectives I want to provide are, one, my personal perspective, and then secondly, the Business Council perspective. And prior to joining with the Business Council, I was with Shell. And Shell was not the company that had the disaster. However, that affected the entire industry. Deepwater Horizon explosion affected the whole industry and it shut down the Gulf. At the time, the president of Shell pulled together a small team and essentially said, I want you to go along the Gulf Coast, each of the producing states, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, and identify ways that Shell can help the communities that were suffering as a result of the Gulf being shut down. Now, of course, the company that that experienced the explosion, they were focusing on stopping the oil flow, and that was their job. But Shell and other companies came together to identify ways to address the needs along the Gulf Coast. And I'm really proud to have been a part of the team that identified how is it we can come into the communities and address the need for food. You know, here it is, particularly from commercial fishermen, they had no source of income. So how is it we can address that? How is it we can help, not knowing how long the Gulf Coast is going to be shut down, employing on a temporary basis some of the individuals who were directly affected by that. Had a chance to see some of the oil spill firsthand in some areas, particularly some of the smaller islands where we had migratory birds on and how it affected them. So I had a chance to see that. I guess one of the key things, messages I want to leave with all of us is that when we have disasters like that, we know that the company or business that's directly connected with it, certainly they are hands-on addressing it, but it's an opportunity for others to come together to help address the needs as well. From a business council perspective, I had an opportunity a couple of days ago to interview one of the members who has since retired to share a story and he was with GM at the time. Their opportunity to help came by way of, we have all of these, if you recall, the booms that were deployed in order to help minimize the spread of the oil, minimize as much as possible. What do we do with these booms now that they are soaked with oil? So this individual who has a tremendous mindset in terms of repurposing materials looked at it and said, you know what, there's a way we can repurpose this, and we have to separate the oil from the boom. So he got with 2 or 3 other individuals. So from a technology standpoint, they were able to deploy a mobile unit and also get the booms and separate the oil from the booms. So they had a method of processing the oil, and then also the material that was left, processing it in such a way that it became repurposed material. And actually they were able to use some of the material, I think it was in the 2010 or 2011 Chevy Volt, some of the car parts under the engine, under the hood. So they were able to use this repurposed material as part of the value chain for one of the vehicles that they produced. I thought that was tremendous. Now, he made it real clear to me that this was not an easy sale at all. As a matter of fact, he said that he walked into, I guess, the boardroom and put down on the table, okay guys, I want to take this oil boom, this oil soaked boom, and we want to convert it and use it in the under the hood of one of our cars. And he was almost thrown out of the room, you can imagine. But one of the messages I guess I want to leave for all of us is in dealing with disasters is to be very persistent. Because most likely you're going to meet up with a lot of resistance up front, but the ones who have that strong desire to really make a difference, and by the way, there are a lot of solutions that come to the table when you get a disaster. You have experts that appear out of everywhere. So I understand the need to vet and the like, and you have to do that, of course. So one of the things I would imagine we'll see later today is really some ideas that on the surface it's like, did he just say that? Or did they really just say that? But in reality, that could serve as a tremendous way of addressing not only that immediate need, but some long-term methods of addressing similar types of catastrophes that occur. And I guess just a minute or two on the Hurricane Harvey. I'm not from Texas. I'm a native of North Carolina, and my wife and I moved to Houston from Cincinnati, Ohio. We wanted to get away from real winter. We thought we did, okay, but we didn't. But Hurricane Harvey for us, and we're certainly thankful and very blessed that personally our house did not experience the flooding, but there was flooding around us. So we were, we were locked in. But we were able to see inundation maps of areas around us, and we had several friends who were in mandatory evacuation zones, but they didn't know it. So I was watching the news and watching the locals, and I called them and I said, look, you need to get out of there. And we had to explain why, and we were able to take them in. And they had some relatives in from California. Welcome to Houston. So we were able to bring some friends over, and for several days, we were able to help put them up. But, so the main point around all disasters is there's always an opportunity to do what you can on whatever small level it is, but also pull together resources that are needed in order to address it at scale. So those are my examples, Seth.
All right, Claude, thanks for sharing those experiences, and thank you all. And I have no doubt we could actually finish the day with just this single question, but we're not. So we're gonna move on to one more question, and then we're actually gonna go straight to questions from you all. So, please.
Well, thank you very much. Before I ask the question, I want to remove my tie, so I don't get confused the high university administration here. So this is out. Okay. So the question is, what are the sustainability challenges faced by the low capacity communities in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi? You may take some specific examples from the past experience. Who would like to take that one? Okay.
I'll take a stab.
Okay.
What are some of the challenges? From a climate perspective overall, and I think I made this comment in my opening remark, we know that underserved communities already are challenged from climate-related impacts, and when we have disasters, it just amplifies it even more. I guess one of the responses I would have is to be mindful of that. I like the example, Pamela, that you gave of, in terms of deployment of resources. You don't always deploy resources where they're needed most. And where that's happening, I think collectively we can do a much better job of that. In terms of sustainability, I mentioned earlier we're being very intentional about including underserved communities as part of the solutions to the challenges that we're experiencing. So that is a way, and when you interview, when we talk with residents of the communities, they already have some excellent ideas of how we can address some of the challenges that are out there. So let's include them now as we continue workshops. Let's be intentional about including representatives from underserved communities.
If I could add my perspective, I would say, a hurricane is very different from a tornado. As a mayor, we've dealt with a tornado here locally. A tornado can hit an entire community. It can hit 4 houses. And it's pretty easy, if it hits 4 houses or 20 houses, to know exactly where you need to deploy your resources. And the house right next to a destroyed house with a tornado might be completely unaffected. And the people who are there to help the person can go right to the front yard and address it. If you have a hurricane which could address and destroy 2 states, and you're trying to figure out how to manage that level of crisis, it's a completely different problem, okay? It's longer term, it's a wider swath, and you have to look at it completely different. And there's different people who can help in the first hours and the first days. As the mayor, I'm here to represent everyone in the community, and in do it, but I can't represent other states. I don't know what's going on in West Texas while I'm dealing with my problem here, if it's a statewide issue or if it's a regional issue. So in the very short moments of an injury, you have an accident, do you call FEMA when you get in a car accident? No. The people who are in the accident get out and they try to help the person. The people who are driving by help the person. There's got to be a sense of community, or you don't solve any of your short, immediate problems. And if you're relying on FEMA to do anything in the first 48 hours of a disaster, you've really not planned properly, because they can't do that. They can't effectively do that. If they were everywhere, then you'd probably hang the elected official who did that, because they would have wasted all of your resources before the disaster happened. And that's one of the real challenges we have with sustainability and working through disasters, is the reality of the problem. I mean, who backed up all their files on their computer today? Okay, one person. I don't believe you. But you know, like, we all know when that happens, you're like, oh, I wish I had done it, right? And that's the challenge with. But look, we have so many different types of disasters that can happen. To properly plan for them all is a challenge. The geographic spread, how long term or short term are they? With Uri. Uri affected us locally, and it affected us statewide here in Texas. And a lot of people didn't understand that. So another challenge is communications. All an individual family may know is, hey, I've lost my power. What's going on? I'm getting cold. As we start rolling through and trying to fix issues, we've got to communicate what we're doing locally. We own a power company in the city of Bryan. We serve Bryan, College Station, and other people in the region, and we're managing that. Well, we have to manage the power that's down, but the grid for the entire state of Texas has to be balanced. If you don't have the same amount being produced as being used, I know we have a lot of engineers here, but even engineers don't think about that. The fact that there's a constant orchestra being conducted for electricity, and if you don't match it enough, the grid goes down. And if the grid goes down, it's never gone down in the history of Texas. It could take a month for us to get power, 2 months for us to get power back. We don't even know fully how to restart, because we've never done it. Okay, so while we're worrying about this in Aggie land, we have an entire state organization telling us, hey, you've got to donate 30% of your power to us to keep this grid alive throughout the state of Texas. We don't understand that, because they're managing it literally second to second. Our citizens don't manage it. So these are the real world challenges when you're in a leadership position dealing with this, and you're a citizen dealing with it. There's funding, there's resources, there are competing needs ahead of time, communications, coordination. I mean, with COVID is the same thing. COVID, we had local needs. We realized that we need to be engaging with our hospitals. We didn't have that set up. We realized that within the region, who's making decisions? And my decisions impacting other counties. The governor in Texas, is it a one-size-fit-all? If you're out in the middle of Big Bend, why would you have the same policy as here? I've heard someone mention that New York is not the same as Texas in terms of climate. There's a reason why a disaster in New York with snow is not really a disaster, because they've built the systems that you're talking about, and they probably solved that one, because it happens all the time. And going back to Texas, you'd probably get hung if you spent all your time focusing just on 1 inch of snow. We just shut the whole place down except for the GRE Center, apparently. Okay? But all those things are tough. Inventorying your resources. So to me, what I would challenge you to say, what can we do practically to prepare for these challenges with the limited resources? You're not going to change that world. I promise you. You're not going to be. You have to say, with what we have now, what can we do to be as prepared as we can? How can we inventory the assets that we have, because we may want to redeploy them? How do we make sure that we have good communication structures between all these different bodies? You know, we didn't know what to do with COVID. I literally called the mayor of College Station, I called the county judge, I called the president of the university, the system chancellor, Blinn College is here, I called the chancellor there, called the CEOs of our 4 different hospitals here, called the school districts. What are we going to do with the schools here? We started up a daily huddle. there was no formal structure. We literally just started communicating, and I ended up putting together a daily huddle for all of us to try to muddle through all this stuff, because the challenges changed from day one, week one, versus 18 months later when we're looking for a vaccine, and how do we manage getting that out. So to me, those are all the challenges. And the other challenge that you're going to deal with is war weariness. You know, is sustainability sustainable? Okay, that's my challenge to you. You know, when you fight a war, people get tired of that war. Whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's a pandemic, it's COVID, and you're also dealing with values. I mean, I know I'm all over the place, but I'm just trying to be real quick, because this will be my one chance to probably engage you guys. China had a one-child policy. You know, that you could argue, and I'm not one of them because my values are different, but you could argue that they probably did a ton more than any other place for sustainability. But is that matching, you know, our values here in this country, where we say we're endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which might include, do I want to have more than one child? So policy, all those things tie into sustainability, and we have to, whether it's looking at all of our citizens saying what are the values in our community, our state, our country, or between countries, and try to get some consensus on what we can do, how we can prepare for it, and then how we can manage it, communicate well together, and not necessarily solve these problems, but manage them as best we can. And the other challenge with the sustainability is if I prepare and I've got twice as much water in the community and twice as much electricity, what do we end up doing? We bring twice as many people in, right? So now we're just growing the problem. So is sustainability being able to continue to sustain growth, or is it being able to continue to sustain the desired future conditions that we all would like? And you know, which one of those is a constant and which one of those is controllable and a variable? So that's my challenge to you, to help us solve those questions, but to know that those are real world constraints.
Just one thing, and I love where this conversation is going, and I love that you said community, and that community, what are their needs? And actually asking that question, right? And so the nonprofits of the world, we spend millions of dollars every year going into communities after disaster. And sometimes it's the same community, and you're rebuilding back the same way. So I would encourage you to engage. As the Texas WOAD chair, I can give you a platform to talk to some of these nonprofits that have been in these areas and have rebuilt and see the issues and the problems, so that maybe together research and nonprofit and disaster can help to maybe talk through some of those issues and sustainability. But it has to be at the community level.
Thank you. Just a couple of points from my own professional and personal experience. I like very much what the Honorable Mayor said about practical things to do. And the question was about low capacity communities in the 3 states, if I remember right. So reflection 1, I think all knowledge is global, and I go back to your slide about the modified Stokes model. How do you use output, knowledge, and technology at the service of society? So how does it apply here? Reflection 2, I think there's a difference between creeping disasters and disasters that happen suddenly. Drought is an example of a creeping disaster. So for communities like this, one of the lessons we learned was it's really important to engage upstream and in advance to create awareness of what happens when you have a creeping disaster coming up. How does it impact people's incomes, livelihoods, none of that. And the responses to that may be somewhat different from the response to preparing for a hurricane or a cyclone, where the impact is much more short-term, much more localized, but you can actually prepare for it in a very different way. Reflection 3, I think it goes back to something you said a little while ago, Kathy, about relationships. I think especially in low-capacity communities or communities which have challenges of different kinds, how well they prepare and how well you can help them prepare depends very much on the relationships you have, and you talked about that too. And that's a lesson we have learned globally in the work we've done in the World Bank for disaster management. Next reflection would be, perhaps in this initiative, as you look at the next stage, you may want to look at the lessons or the research that is being funded or financed by entities like the World Bank or other regional bodies, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There could be things that you could use. And I'd be happy to put you in touch with whoever you think would be helpful for you. And lastly, again at the micro level, every disaster we found, sudden disasters, especially floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and the like, the first few hours, as the mayor said, are really critical because that response is always local. And we have found that gathering information about damage and deaths and destruction and getting that information out is the biggest challenge for the first few hours or even days. And I've learned in this country that one of the most effective ways communities deal with that is actually through using amateur radio operators, the ham radio system. And the American Radio Relay League and the federal government and other governments have initiatives. There's the ARIES system and others. The reason I'm saying this is I'm a full disclosure amateur radio operator myself. I have a license from the FCC. Rural communities, we have ham radio operators. And when the power lines are down, when the phones don't work, when the roads can't be used, it is these battery operated radio operators who actually collect the information, compile them, relay them, and convey instructions from other agencies to the people of the locality. It's a really cheap resource, but an extremely effective one. And again, if there's any way we can help you do that for the states here, we'd be very happy to do that. And lastly, my affiliation here is, I didn't get a chance to tell you, is about the entity I work with now called the New Generation Foundation. But I think the reason I'm here today is that my wife and I have a startup that deals with issues to do with climate change and how also to get women and girls thinking about STEM jobs in the green economy of the future. And again, we'd love to work with you on this and help you as you go along. So please feel free to use us. Sorry.
Thank you very much, panelists. I think we have 3 more questions, but we're going to open this time, little bit of time to the audience at this time. So any questions from the audience on these 2 issues?
First, going back to the spirit of the FEWS, which is the food, water, energy system, and that interconnections. We have been talking in more or less from a disciplinary standpoint. How do you see coherence? Because all of these are interlinked, and you cannot separate them in terms of the action. And our governance system of these are in silos. So how do we break these silos so that we can improve the resilience? That's one question. The other, Mr. Mukherjee, you brought up a very important, I personally am sensitive to it because I've experienced it, which is corruption. When you have flow, you're going to have money flowing, you have resources flowing into these disasters. Fortunately, we have acceptable, quote-unquote, governance system in this country. But if you're going globally, that's not the case. So how do you engage civil society as a watchdog for making sure that these resources are going to do what they are intended to do? And how can we learn from that experience into the implementation of this project moving forward as a corruption, as a anti-corruption, as an enabler for resilient communities? Thank you.
I'll just say, as the mayor of a low capacity, I mean, we're not New York City. I can't dust off all the plans that a city of 20 million would have. One of the things that I would ask you to figure out is how to kill 2 birds with 1 stone with these challenges: food, water, energy. An example. I'm not giving solutions. I'm just saying things that interest me. The mechanical engineer in me knows that electric cars are still probably not more environmentally sound than combustion engine cars. People don't want to hear that, but if you look at the whole industrial cycle, those of us that look at that probably knows that's not true. But during a disaster, not only do I hope that will change one day by our continued investment in research in electric vehicles and electric technology, but in a disaster, how nice would it be if we could use an electric car as a generator for our homes? And if we have people who are moving towards that, you start solving these very basic practical problems. How can I take maybe my local food bank and figure out how to transform it to kill two birds with one stone, and if we have a local disaster, that helps in the first 48 hours. How do I go and look at things that get more funding and say, can I put sustainability into this so that we can also check things off the list? So that's one of my challenges in the solution finding is how do we do those things?
And I guess I work for the Division of Academic and Strategic Collaborations. I'd like to follow up on one thing, and it's just a question. How do you overcome the pinball syndrome of bureaucratic governmental agencies? I have worked for many years in the colonias of Texas. That's part of the College of Architecture. You write a proposal, and it has a little bit of health. Oh, that belongs to Health and Human Services. It includes a little bit of housing. Oh, that belongs to Housing and Urban Development. And it gets passed around like a pinball. And sometimes it gets like this between two agencies that cannot decide where does this fit. Everything you have talked about blurs the boundaries of existing bureaucratic and entrenched status quo. This is the way it's always been, and we're not willing to change into anything new. How do you address that? Because this proposal has a chance of doing something like that.
Maybe I'll take a stab at responding both to your question and to yours. I see them as kind of linked. As a former civil servant and as a recovering civil servant, I think civil services everywhere, governments everywhere, have to function in siloed form because of the nature of what they do. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's a fact of life. And the reflection from my experience would probably be, in response to your question and to your question, maybe if you kept the community at the center of the effort that you're doing, then things could begin to be less like pinballs, the silos would be less apparent. We found that useful. Because in the work that I used to do with my operational teams, we'd be dealing with countries or regions of countries, and always, once we went to the communities, those silos would kind of be a little bit weaker. So that's reflection one. Reflection two about corruption. Now, I have to be careful about what I say, but this is my personal view, right? I think the best antidote we have found to corruption so far is sunlight, transparency. To the extent that you have resources flowing into communities post-disaster, money, materials, etc. The more transparency there is in how these materials are used, how the money is used, how it is allocated, what happens after it reaches the person or the entity to whom it's supposed to go, and the sooner that process happens, I think the more difficult it is for corrupt acts to happen. And then we have found in other contexts, not necessarily in the US context, that post-event audits tend to be very important if they're done the right way and if their findings are publicized or submitted to the Assembly or the legislature. The US has very strong mechanisms for dealing with that, and ultimately it's a question of how well the institutions work. But in a nutshell, transparency is probably the most important antidote to corruption.
Matthew Berg of Samfero, very philosophically, how will we know when we are successful? Is it the number of hazards that become disasters? Is it the number or severity of impacts among people? Is it the time to recovery from the disaster? What is our measure of success?
That's an excellent question. I don't have a full answer. Let me just start by saying that. But let me also say that from a sustainability perspective, sometimes the metrics to measure the success are not typical metrics. You have to really look closely at what is a true measure of success, and it may vary depending on what's going on, whether it's a disaster or or project. Sometimes sustainability-related items don't fit in a standard model, I'll just say it like that. So I said the short answer is it depends.
I would say, just as an example, we talk about drought. We have, within the state of Texas, a requirement as a city. Every city has to put together a 50-year desired future conditions. We call it a DFC, right? And we look at it and say, 50 years from now, what is that desired future condition? My feeling is that that should be when we look at these wider long-term issues, that would be my recommendation, is to say, what is that 50-year desired future condition? It's very different from if you have a tornado or what's happening with water and electricity in a short-term storm. For that, I think we love our neighbor. We're going to all roll up our sleeves. We're going to work. We're going to blow through the bureaucracies. Our 2 local hospitals that compete with each other, the CEOs get together every morning and say, how can we all go and deal with the trauma that we're facing? So it's very 2 different things. But I think you're thinking more of that long term, at least I perceive that. And to me, I'd say, what is the desired future conditions that we want? The mechanical engineer in me always kind of feels that this whole thing is like trying to create a self-perpetuating machine, right? I mean, the first law of thermodynamics is you can't get more than you put into it. So we can't win in this sustainability world. The second law says you're actually going to lose things because you lose heat, and so you're actually going to lose. And the third law of entropy says we can never stop playing this game, that we will lose, right? So if the goal is for our world to never have entropy, it's a failure before we begin. So to me, I think to make it not too depressing, I look at the 50-year outlook for what's the world that we would like to achieve, and how do we get there? Does it mean if waters are going to rise that we've got to go and do everything we can to save Miami? Or do we say, man, over the next 50 years, maybe we shouldn't be putting 2 million more people into Miami? I don't know the answer to that, but I think the solutions start getting easier to look at when you look at your values and you look at where you want to be 50 years from now, and what are in the magic quadrant. There's big impact for low effort, really low impact for high effort. You would never want to be there. So I would say right now we just got to focus on that magic quadrant of getting the biggest bang for our buck, and then worry about the other 2 things that are harder to do long term but have a big impact.
Okay, so I'm going to go quick, and I'm going to tell you another 1980s story. And I'm going to tell you, first of all, that I think we've had many successes. We still have a long way to go. So 1982 was my first summer in Texas. I was living down in Corpus Christi, working at Padre Island National Seashore. And the way we got information about hurricanes was the 5 o'clock evening news. And Domino's Pizza used to deliver pizzas with a hurricane tracking map. And probably every home on the coast had one of those Domino's Pizza hurricane tracking maps. And that's how you tracked hurricanes in the 1980s, by putting a point on the map after you heard the local news. And so if you fast forward to today, we've got better models, better data, better ways to communicate advancing storms and potential disasters. And so I think we've had a lot of success in that area. And people can now understand much further in advance what their options are and what their response might be. So I think we've had a lot of successes in that part of the disaster arena.
I think it's almost ironic that your resilience and safety in that context literally depended on a game piece of a game of chance.
Right.
Like there's something on the head about that.
And I think one thing that I will point out as the PI of this project is that the resilience, one of the things in resilience is time. The metric is time. And that time depends on which part of the disaster management cycle you're looking at. Response and recovery, you need to shorten the time. Mitigation and preparedness, you need to have like maximum time for that and the resources for that. So Also, across different systems, it will vary. So the concept of system and scale and the concept of what resilience means to each system varies. So for energy systems, it's that second that Mayor Nelson talked about. For other things, it may be a little bit more. So it depends on which system you're dealing with. So I think that's very subjective to which system and which scale you're dealing with things. So that's the way we are trying to, but we are trying to look across different scales and different systems to see if there is any commonality so that we can maximize the resources and minimize the costs to these things. If that's something that I could add.
Measuring success, I think you also have to look at formality and informality in the system. The more informality there is, the more difficult it is to measure the right things to do success. And secondly, as the pandemic has taught us, you can get resilience at the expense of efficiency. There's always a trade-off, and we are yet to understand that kind of trade-off in the context of disaster resilience.
Right.